Bibles, we will, to Psalm 3, and I've really enjoyed our study through the Psalms. We've called Psalmsational. Get that out right. I've enjoyed collaborating with Pastor Adam, Pastor Tim to put this together, and us trying to decide and figure out what Psalms to cover and try to get a selection for you. But Psalm 3, as Pastor already has mentioned, falls into this same category that we looked at this morning, and it's you see it's associated and attached to this episode with Absalom. In fact, it says, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. And I've always found these sort of historically annotated psalms fascinating because, you know, you just sort of hear the narrative from the outside. Absalom did this, David did this, et cetera, et cetera. But then you open the Psalms up and you kind of can hear his heart, what he's feeling. How did he deal with this? And how was this going to take place? And we're just going to talk about seeking rest, because in all of this turmoil that he's in, he's seeking rest in this rebellion with Absalom, his own son. You recall it all started with in chapter 13 through 18, as it covers this story of 2 Samuel. And Absalom's revenge against his half-brother by the name of Amnon. And Amnon sexually molests his full sister, Tamar. And it's just a colossal mess. And you might wonder, why didn't David be more harsh in dealing with this obvious, gross, horrible sin in his own family? And I don't know if I can answer that, except the one thing on David's record was having a very similar problem, not exactly the same, but a similar problem with Bathsheba. And maybe he felt like his own ability to speak to that was hampered somewhat. I don't know. That's certainly no excuse, but perhaps that was in the background. And as Pastor pointed out, he was plotting against this, and finally it reaches that point of rebellion in that chapter that you read for us, where he gets everything in place, and finally the officials come to David and says, you have one choice. You need to flee, leave Jerusalem. And this was the city that David and his men had conquered, that he set up. This city was the city where they brought the Ark of the Covenant into. This was the city that was the city of God. This was the place, the capital, and now he has to flee in shame. And you think about the levels of hurt that you can think of. The turmoil in his own home, his own daughter, his son that was killed, and then Absalom was banished for a couple of years, and then he's allowed to come back. And don't you love the part where Absalom says, you know, I had made this vow to God that if I got to come back to Jerusalem, I'd go pay this vow to God, and I'm going to go out and have this sacrifice. And that was just a ruse to get everybody out so they could further the plot. And then to have the hearts of God's people stolen by Absalom. Remember, this is the David that, you know, did some great things. This is the David that we talked about this morning. The people were saying, you know, Saul killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. He was the champion. He was the hero. And the humiliation of having to flee Jerusalem was amazing. He was abandoned by many of those who were close to him. People turned on him. He was ridiculed as he's leaving. There were people hurling insults at him, and it was just a terrible thing. And, of course, his life was in danger, and many lives were in danger by this attacking army and this, I guess you'd just say, civil war that was being fought in all of that. Some ways I think this was a greater burden in David's life than when he was fleeing from Saul, because God was withholding for a time, during the time of Saul, what he had never had. It was just delayed. Here, what he'd already had was being taken away from him. And also, there's one fact that we sometimes don't look at carefully, and there's a reason for this turmoil in his own family. It's because after the sin with Bathsheba, God tells him the sword's not going to part from your own house. And this is part of reaping what you sow with that. So a lot of that is on him. So in verse 1, we read these words. Lord, how they have increased who trouble me. Many are they who rise up against me. So I want to just share with you a little bit of an outline, a little bit of some steps or a pattern, maybe we'd say it that way, of how when we have those moments when it seems like the world's just pressing in on us, like everything's falling apart. We feel that pressure. I just want some relief from this. I just want some rest from this. I just want to be in a place where it's safe again, where it's comfortable again. And with that sort of emotion, he says, he turns to God. First of all, here's some things that I think we see him do that we also can do, all right? make your complaint before God. That's what he does in verses 1 and 2. He just tells God how he feels. He tells God what it feels like. Lord, how they have increased to trouble me. Those who are troubling me. Notice the word increase stands out as an interesting marker. There's more than there used to be. There's plenty of them. It's getting worse. It's going downhill. And it says, many are those who rise up against me. And I'm sure in his mind, imagining, and sometimes in his ear, actually, he's hearing the taunts of his people, the people that he has given his life for, the people that he's loved, the people that he's led. Now they're turning on him, and to feel that ridicule. It's one thing when you're having your enemies ridiculed, right? Have you ever been down to what is now the Go Mart ballpark? It used to be the Power Park. You know the guy that throws toast into the stands? If you've been there, you know what I'm talking about. They have this little thing where whenever the opposing team strikes out, everyone chants, "You are toast," and Rod stands up and throws burnt toast into the audience, and people, whatever do you think that's smart or that's cool, whatever. But you notice they never stand up and yell, "You are toast," when one of our guys strike out, right? I mean, that's for those. But here it's like his own team is saying, "You're gone, you're toast. You're the one receiving the ridicule." That's why he says, "I feel this." So when do we pour out this complaint before God? Well, we do it whenever trouble comes. Whenever trouble comes, that's the time to just lift our voice to him and say, "Lord, the trouble is coming in my life. I just want to tell you all about it." And we also need to understand that when I use the word complaint, I use it advisedly. All right? And note this, it is okay to complain to God. It's never okay to complain about God. Okay? So we don't want to question his judgment, don't want to question his kindness to us. But you have to understand, he sees something wrong. And sometimes we get this kind of out of place in our life. When we overview the fact that they are wrong, which in this case they were, if that's all you focus on, it leads to bitterness and hatred, and also that seeking revenge we talked about this morning. If we internalize it and say, "What's wrong with me?" to an extent that's pushed out of proportion, then that leads to depression and hopelessness in our own heart. Or, worst of all, if we say, "Lord, you've done something wrong," that leads us to disrespect and disbelief, all of which puts us in a very difficult place. So what he does is just simply says, "Lord, this is how I feel. This is what I'm going through. I want to just express it to you." And God welcomes this, because he's not charging God with any wrong. And he's not just kind of beating up on himself. He just simply says, "This is the case. Lord, how they have increased to trouble me. Many are they who rise up against me." So we make a complaint before God when trouble comes. We secondly do it when trouble mounts, when it gets more and more and more and more. That's that increasing part. And also when all seems hopeless. It says, "Many are they who say of me," verse 2, "there is no help for him in God." What a chilling statement. Even God can't help him. God's not going to get him out of this one. God may have helped him with Goliath. God may have helped him somewhere along the line with Saul, but there's no hope for him. By the way, we as God's people should be very careful to never say that we dictate what God can and what God can't do, or what God will and what God won't do. That's up to him, and we just respectively accept that. But that's sort of where he's at. He just seems hopeless. And we need to just be able to say, God, and there's a theological term for this, God's transcendent sovereignty. In other words, God just does and chooses whatever he sees best, and what he chooses and does is best, even if we can appreciate it, understand it, or it seems totally out of place and out of character. We do that. We just say he can do whatever he wills, whenever he wills, at whatever time he wills, and he has the right to do that, his transcendent sovereignty. It's only bounded by God's perfect character, his infinite wisdom, and his unending love. So all of those choices are bounded by that. And we just need to be careful. This is a very tragic thing to say. They who say of me, there is no help for God and help of him in God. Be very careful. One of the things back in 1912, you remember from our history books, I don't think any of us were around then, but the Titanic set sail, and one of the things that has been passed to us, the engineers that developed this thing, it had watertight compartments and all this stuff, and one of the things they said, even God couldn't sink her. I'm not saying God sunk her because of that particular taunt, but it was not a taunt that should have ever been made, because the works of man are always subject to a higher authority. So when things seem hopeless, when the trouble is mounting, whenever trouble comes, just follow this pattern. Lord, I just bring it to you, and I offer to you what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, what it feels like, what I'm going through. To him, not about him. And when everyone else is chanting and taunting and saying, you and I are toast, remember this: God indeed is able. So notice the word Selah appears after verse 2. Remember, we've talked about that word that appears in multiple Psalms. It seems to be a pause, a break to think, a break to contemplate, maybe a break of musical annotation as well, like a rest, and to take a moment and just say, now let's move on. So not only that, should we make a complaint before God, we can find our comfort in God. Find our comfort in God. So as he goes to the Lord, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm thinking, that just sort of shifts into, this is what I should be thinking about when I think about God. This is reordering my thought. And I think the good of expressing ourselves fully to God in prayer has a way of just ordering our thoughts. And sometimes our mind just gets to flowing in the right way. And I kind of think you see this. He says, but you, O Lord, are a shield for me. And one of the things that you also need to take note of, this is a little bit of a side note for you, but notice in verse 3 it says, but you, O Lord, and it's capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. It's also the first word of the psalm as well. That's that word that is the word for God himself. In fact, sometimes we translate it into English. One of the ways to do it is say Jehovah, or to take the Hebrew letters and kind of mush them together and say Yahweh. But we don't know how it was pronounced because they would write the consonants out in the Old Testament, but not put the vowels in. So we don't know which vowels to put in to make which sounds. And so it was just left that way. I just kind of like saying Lord and annotate it with the capital letters so you know that's the word without maybe trying to put words to it. But it's that word that says God is this covenant God with us, the God of Israel, the God who is the I am at the burning bush, the God who spoke everything into existence at creation, the God at whose word everything will be culminated in to the glory of the Lord Jesus Christ. But you, O Lord, you are a shield for me. So when you find your comfort in God, you think about, first of all, what God is to you. And he uses three phrases to help us understand this: shield, glory, and a lifted up head. That's what he says. Lord, you are a shield for me, my glory, and the one who lifts my head. So let's think about each of those for just a moment, and maybe that'll help us. For a shield, well, we know what a shield is. We can picture that. We've seen enough pages in our history books, and we've seen movies and that sort of thing. A metal or wood or whatever it's made out of, a shield to protect you from projectiles coming, or the swing of a sword, or the thrust of a spear. So it was a defensive weapon. So it's a way of saying, God, you are my shield. You are my protector. You are the one who can help me through all of this mess of life. So he goes back to saying, Lord, in spite of this thing with Absalom, despite of the fact that my life is threatened, the fact that I'm on the run, I've had to flee, Lord, you are still my shield. But a shield was also used for something else that we oftentimes do not think of. Shields often were used as a way to express something about the army or the nation it represented. Shields oftentimes would have something painted on the outside, or if it was metal, like a metal shield, something was embossed into it. The Romans were very big at this. They would put like an eagle on their shield, or sometimes they'd put the image of one of their emperors, that sort of thing. Of course, that occurs a lot later in history. But sometimes the shield were designed to say, this is us, sort of like soldier's uniform will have the flag of the United States on them, or we fly the flag over military installations, that sort of thing. It was a way of saying whose side we are on and whose side we are defending here. So he says, Lord, you're my shield. It's a way of saying you're a shield for me. You're the one who I can count on. You're the one that's on my side and I'm on your side. We are a team. We're together in this. So it's more than just protection from what's coming at you. It's identification with the person who has given his word to protect you. And there's just a bit of calmness and hope in that, comfort in that, if we could use that word again. And then he says this, you're my shield and my glory. Now, glory is a word that we use in reference to God, obviously. It's also a word that was used quite commonly and somewhat uniquely for kings of their day. the king, they'd say things like, "Oh, king, live forever." Everyone knew the king wasn't going to live forever, but you just said that because I just love you so much and you're so wonderful. We just wish you'd live forever, or something like that. So the glory, the respect that a king would receive. And David probably was used to being treated with respect and reverence, and now he's on the run like a hunted fugitive fleeing for his life, like someone just, having to get out of a disaster. But he said, "Lord, you are my glory." And I think this is talking about his glory, not God's glory, but glory given to him. You're the one that I can trust in. You're the one that you lift me up. You will vindicate me. And we'll see that a little bit later in this psalm as well. And the one who lifts up my head. Now that's an interesting Hebrew construction. The first place it is found is back in the 40th chapter of Genesis in the story of Joseph. Remember when Joseph got tossed into prison? And he's there. Remember, there was the butler who was the one who would serve wine to the Pharaoh, and then there was the baker who also was preparing food. And they must have done something really bad wrong because they're in prison along with Joseph. Okay, and they both had a dream, and Joseph is by the power of God, the gifting of God, he can interpret the dreams. And for the butler, by the way, the baker did not have quite as good a dream, and you can read about that in chapter 40 of Genesis. But the butler, he says, he had to sign 3 days. He says, God will lift up your head. In other words, God will turn his attention to you. It's almost like, hey, you don't have to bend down and look at the ground, but Pharaoh is going to give you that lift up your head. Now look at me. Here, I'm going to tell you what's going to be. Give you his attention, in other words. I'm going to raise your chin so that you'll look into my face. He says, Lord, you're the one that raises my chin so I can look into your face and see your glory and know that you will restore my glory and you will be the shield. Not only will you protect me, but I'm identified on the same team with the one who protects me. All that just brings comfort into his life. It lifts up his head. So that's what God is to him. And we oftentimes should take stock of what God is to us. And sometimes just pull out a piece of paper and a pen and say, what is God to me? He's my Savior. He's my Creator. And just keep going. And just remind yourself all those wonderful things he is. He's our friend. He's the one that we follow, our shepherd. He's the door. I mean, all these pictures, all these images that you can easily call to mind in Scripture, it should just be that God is those things to us. And it's all about that connection that he is to us. Secondly, for what God has done for you. And that's what David recounts next. I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard, yes, that's right, verse 4. I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me from his holy hill. What's God done? First of all, God hears our cry. When you pray to him, it gets through. It really does. It gets through the static of our own thinking. It gets through the gloom of our own world. It gets through the limitations of our own mind and heart, and it gets through. Lord, you heard my cry, and God will do that. I cried to the Lord with my voice, and God does that. And he says, God heard him. I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me from his holy hill. Holy hill is Jerusalem, Mount Zion. Isn't it interesting? Where was he leaving, and where was he going? He was going out in the wilderness, and he was leaving Jerusalem. But even though he was physically separated from Jerusalem, in his conception, God, where the Ark of the Covenant was, the holy place was, Holy of Holies was, the tabernacle was at that time, that's where God was. He's saying, even though I am physically removed from there, Lord, I have made my cry, and you've heard me from your holy hill. Sometimes we feel like we're a little bit far away from God sometimes. Sometimes that feeling kind of sets in and sinks in and pulls us low. But you know what? God can hear us from his holy place even today. And now I love this next part, verse 5. I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. One of the things that sometimes is a marker of our anxiety or unrest is our lack of sleep. And many of us have had a sleepless night where we've had something on our heart, something on our mind, something troubling us, and sleep is just taken from us, or a big part of our sleep. In fact, whenever I go to see my doctor, one of the things I'm always at, how are you sleeping? That's one of the markers of, how, I guess, your physical health and maybe your mental health as well. And I know there are other things that trouble our sleep just besides the condition of our mind and our heart. But nonetheless, he says, I lay down and slept. Of all the things you would think David would say, you know what, I'm just not sleeping too well these days. It's a way of saying, I knew what the Lord has done for me. He's given me rest. He's given me sleep. And that's why I titled this Seeking Rest, because you just see it right here in this verse. And now if you kind of look over to chapter 4 for just a moment, Psalm 4, if you read Psalm 3 and 4 together, there's a lot of similarities. In fact, one of the thoughts is, you can't prove this, but one of the thoughts was that maybe chapter 3 and Psalm 3 and Psalm 4 were sort of two parts of the same whole, kind of like the next song, or maybe it was a medley of songs, that sort of thing. But I want you to look down at verse 8 of Psalm 4, because he hits that again. I will both lay down in peace and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. You know, we are sometimes fears what steals our sleep and slumber. You ever wake up startled in the middle of the night because you heard some noise? You know, and maybe you need to check under the bed, make something sure nothing's under there, whatever. And our next door neighbor works on cars, sometimes at odd hours, and he's got one of these power tools that goes zzz. Sounds a little bit like a rattlesnake at times. So sometimes we're sitting around quietly, peacefully, and we're wakened by zzz. So we're dealing with that a little bit. But he says, Lord, you're letting me lay down in peace and let me sleep. Go back to verse 5 of Psalm 3. I lay down and sleep. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. Notice, I love this part. He says, Lord, I see what you've done for me. You've heard my cry. You're letting me sleep. And when I wake up, I'm still here. I'm still here. I'm still in that place where you can help me, in that place where you are there for me. I can have that confidence in you. I can just know that you're a shield for me. And we should start our day with sleep and rise when we're asleep and give thanks to the Lord. That's what he does. And ask the Lord for help. You sustain me, and he has his confidence restored, okay? I found a prayer a while back in a book I happened to be reading, and this was a morning prayer, and I'll just share it with you. Maybe this is one you could use. So far, God, I have done all right. I haven't gossiped, haven't lost my temper, haven't been greedy, grumpy, nasty, selfish, or overindulgent. I'm really glad about that, but in a few minutes, God, I'm going to get out of bed, and from there on, I'm probably going to need a lot more help. So every day is a new day to say, Lord, I'm here, and I got to renew my trust in you. And notice the trust renewed in him is in verse 6. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Have you ever noticed what's the largest number you see in the Bible? Old Testament, New Testament? It's not millions, it's not billions, it's not trillions. It's 10,000. Remember when John in Revelation is describing around the phone, he said there was 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands. It's sort of like that was the top number that they would conceive of. So when he says this, he says, I'm not going to be afraid of 10,000s of people. That in their conception was the biggest number you could pull out and use. So it's a way of saying extreme. He said, I'm not going to be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Talk about some renewed confidence. So what has God done for you? God's heard our cry from his holy hill. He gives us sleep. He gives us renewed confidence the next morning. He gives courage against overwhelming odds to deliver his own and confounding those who are believing contrary and behaving contrary to God's will. And also he gives us this confidence and courage that we can go on. All right? So make your complaint before God. Find your comfort in God, verses 3, 5, and 6. We have a couple more to go, and I want you just to think with me through these things, all right? Next, so find your comfort in God, and then this is sort of an elaboration on that part about crying out to God you saw earlier. But it's, again, this is the words that he uses to cry out to God. So we'll just say it this way. Make your cry to God. Make your request to God, if you want to say it that way, all right? Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. For you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongs to you, Lord. Your blessing is upon your people. Selah. There it is again. We actually skipped the Selah after verse 4. There's actually 3 of them in this psalm. So what's he asking God for? First of all, for deliverance. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. He just says it as it is. Lord, I want you to preserve me. I want you to save me. Now, the whole story with Absalom, it starts out as in a mess. It gets messier, and then it arrives in a colossal mess when they're in the wilderness out fighting. It tells us that more than 20,000 people died in this melee of this civil war, okay? And through it all, David gives the order to his men, don't harm, in essence, Absalom. He still loves Absalom in spite of all this. That's what he wanted. That's not how it actually ended. We'll get to that in just a moment. But he asked for God to forgive him, to deliver him, I should say. He says, "Arise and save me from this physical destruction." And we should cry to him for deliverance from our physical destruction. And so we should just ask for his protection. I know now that I'm a grandfather, I find myself praying over my grandchildren, Lord, protect them physically and spiritually and every other way in life, but protect them physically. We live in an awful world, frankly. You understand some of those dangers. So he asked for that deliverance. And he knows where that deliverance comes from. "Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God." He's, in essence, Lord, I'm asking you, I'm calling you to action. So make your cry to God, first of all, for deliverance by God, and that God would do that. Now, notice how he asked God to be at work. Middle of verse 7. "For you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone, and you have broken the teeth of the ungodly." You know what he's saying to him? He says, "Lord, you've done this before. I just want you to give them a big old haymaker right in the jaw and knock some of their teeth out." Wow. And that's literally what he's saying. And he's calling back to, he's not only asking what God to do in the future, but he's reflecting on what God has done in the past, because this is past tense. "For you have," past tense, "struck all my enemies on the cheekbone." You have, past tense, broken the teeth of the ungodly. God has the ability to deal with bullies, doesn't he? And I'll give you an example. How about Pharaoh in the time of Moses? Was he a bully? Let my people go. No, not going to do that. And by the way, I'm going to take your straw away, and you still got to make all the bricks and all that sort of thing. And you know the rest of that story, and God brings them low. A little audience participation. If Rich can do it, I can do this too, right? Can you think of some other bullies in the Old Testament that God dealt with? Who would you put on that list? What? Goliath, absolutely. Big robo-warrior guy, and God brought him low, absolutely. What else? Saul, yeah, persecuting the church, and he's riding on his donkey to go up to Damascus, and he's going to clean house, and Jesus shows up, and he's off his horse on the ground and struck blind. Yeah, very good. Someone else said something over here? Nebuchadnezzar. Remember? "Oh, this is great Babylon that I've made," and blah, 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 and God gives him the spirit of an animal, and he's out eating grass like an ox for a period of time. Yeah. Who else? Rabshakeh. Okay, help me here. Refresh my memory. Oh, yes. Is that Hezekiah? Yeah, thank you. Yes. That was they woke up the next morning, and 185,000 Assyrians just were laying there dead. Yeah, very good. You talk about a threat, just because and God told Hezekiah, you're going to have a victory without ever raising a hand. Did you have one, Bob? Ahab and Jezebel, yes. Talk about some inglorious ends of both of them, right? If you read about Jezebel's departure, it ain't pretty. Yeah, absolutely. And all that they did. How about Saul in David's life? Remember, we talked about that this morning. What's that? Oh, yes, ma'am. Oh, Sanballat and Tobiah. Remember those guys in the book of Nehemiah? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. How about, remember the Amalekites? Remember after Israel is now in the wilderness and they're heading toward the promised land, the Amalekites come and attack them behind, all the elderly and the sick and the people that were weak, they attack them, and Moses goes up on the mountain, and Hur and Aaron hold up his hands, and they prevailed over the Amalekites, those folks in that way. Yeah, very good. You can think about Jericho. God stopped the sun to help him have the victory, pushed down the walls of Jericho. How about Herod when he locked Peter in prison and God arranged a big jailbreak? So that's some practice for us. Did you have one, Mason? What's that? Balaam? Yeah. God has a way of tearing down those false gods and those people who worship them. Very good. Remember the contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal and all that sort of thing. What's that? Did I hear another one? Okay. Very good. Audience participation is now over, except you've got to keep listening for just a little while longer, okay? So we need to do the same. When we are fearful, we need to come back and say, Lord, what have you done in the past? The pages of Scripture. What have you done in the past in our personal lives? What have you seen us through to renew our strength? And that just gives us, that's how we can seek rest for Him. And lastly, in praise for God, this is how we make our cry to Him. All right? Verse 8. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Enough said, right? It belongs to the Lord exclusively. It belongs to the Lord only. And sometimes we think in this world, oh, this is a solution, or that's a solution, or the next election's a solution, or if the economy gets better, that's the solution, or if we can, God's the only ultimate solution, and we lean on Him. So salvation belongs to you. Your blessing is upon your people, Selah. He just comes to this place where it just lands. I love how it lands. Lord, your blessing is upon your people. Compare that to verse 1. O Lord, they have increased to trouble me, many of those who rise up against me. Verse 8, end of the verse, your blessing is upon your people. He comes from a place of turmoil to a place of comfort and strength as he just does what he does. He makes his complaint to the Lord, not about God, but to God. He finds his comfort in God because he understands what God is to him and what God has done for him, and we should do the same for what God has done for you and I. And make your cry to the Lord for his deliverance, and then you praise God for him being who he is along the way. I want to ask two quick questions, and maybe you can at least annotate them in your mind, if not in your notes, if you're taking notes. And you think about this, and I want to just go back to this phrase that he mentions in verse 5. I laid down and slept, I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. That's that realization that God has taken him through. Have you made it today because God has sustained you? Have you made it to this point because God has sustained you? Obviously, it's because he has. Now, here's where faith kicks in, because you haven't seen this yet. And by definition, faith is in things that you can't see, right? Will you make it to tomorrow? Because God will sustain you then. Will you? Absolutely. If he sustained you today, he sustained you in the past. That says that God, the unchanging God, the God who is not going anywhere, not growing weak, not got to a place where he's not paying attention. God is right there where he's always been. He will sustain us for tomorrow. And in spite of the absolute turmoil of what he went through, God sustained him. Now, you know back where it said that he asked God to break his, in the past you've struck those and so forth, and he says, many are against him, rise up, and so forth. And those are people who were saying there's no help for him in God, all those sort of things we read. You know how it ends, right, with Absalom. One of the things that was true about Absalom was he was a good-looking guy. He had a good head of hair. I don't know what exactly that looked like, but he had a good stack of hair on top of his head. And that was sort of his, what would we say, his thing, his marker, his identity. And he goes riding on his mule in the midst of that battle, and he gets his head stuck in a tree. And the mule goes out, and he's just swinging there. And that's where he met his doom. Essentially, God can do whatever he wants, but sometimes when God judges, he's just as creative and just as pointed and just as efficient in his judgment as he is in his grace. And the one thing that he thought was the wonderful thing was the thing that caught him and held him in place until he was killed on the battlefield. And then David mourns over him. David cries over him. In spite of his defection, says something about the love of a father to a son. Says something about the love of our Father to us who are wayward children. Let's pray.